The Galactic Academy's final test had been the same for thousands of years, an unrelenting trial known as the gauntlet. It was a labyrinth constructed by an ancient, long-extinct civilization, filled with intricate, lethal traps designed to test intelligence, agility, and survival instincts. For centuries, it had been the ultimate measure of a student's worth, weeding out the weak and rewarding only the most adaptable. As the towering metal gates of the trial grounds slid open with a hiss, the competitors stood at the threshold, their various alien features betraying traces of nervous energy. Some flicked their forked tongues in and out, scenting the air for dangers. Others adjusted the glowing interfaces of their exosuits, scanning for weak points in the labyrinth's walls. Weapons hummed as they activated, shields flickered into existence, and survival protocols engaged. Ryan Shelton, the only human in the Academy's history to reach this stage, stood among them. Unlike the others, he had no biotechnological enhancements, no natural exoskeleton to shield him, no regenerative abilities to compensate for failure. He was, in the eyes of the Academy, one of the most fragile species ever admitted. Yet he stood with an unshaken expression, arms crossed, his keen eyes sweeping over the entrance with a detached curiosity that bordered on amusement. The AI professor overseeing the trial materialized as a hovering metallic sphere, its single red optic flickering as it assessed the group. Its voice, a cold, mechanical monotone, echoed through the chamber. "The gauntlet awaits. Your objective is simple: cross the labyrinth and reach the exit alive. The likelihood of success is minimal. Based on historical data, 3% of participants complete the trial. Failure results in elimination. Begin when ready." The floor beneath them trembled as the labyrinth powered up. A low hum resonated through the walls as ancient mechanisms groaned to life. The first corridor stretched ahead, long, foreboding, the walls etched with unfamiliar symbols that pulsed faintly, as if aware of their presence. The students hesitated, their eyes darting to one another. The first move was critical. A towering reptilian contestant with jagged armor plates running down his spine took the initiative, stepping forward with heavy, confident strides. As soon as his foot crossed the threshold, the floor plates beneath him shifted. Without warning, razor-thin energy beams shot from the walls, targeting his limbs with deadly precision. He barely had time to activate his personal shield before the beam sliced across his forearm, leaving a deep, smoking cut. He roared in frustration, retreating hastily as the beams retracted back into the walls. A murmur rippled through the group. A smaller insectoid competitor clicked his mandibles, tapping rapidly on a holographic interface embedded in his wrist. His species was known for superior computational skills, capable of processing thousands of possible outcomes in seconds. He analyzed the shifting patterns of the energy beams, then, with a confident flick of his antennae, darted forward. His multi-jointed limbs moved with inhuman agility as he zigzagged between the activated traps, slipping through the narrow gaps between bursts of light. He almost made it. At the very last second, a hidden panel in the ceiling slid open, releasing a high-speed projectile. It struck his thorax with brutal force, sending him tumbling backward, his exoskeleton cracked and smoking. He let out a pained screech as he crawled away, defeated. Ryan exhaled slowly, watching as the others processed what had just happened. The first few steps into the labyrinth had already claimed two of their finest. The traps weren't just deadly, they were unpredictable, designed to adapt to each species' strengths and weaknesses. He had read about the gauntlet before. No one had ever crossed it without injury. Some had survived by sheer endurance, limping across the finish line with shattered bones and scorched flesh. But he had no intention of getting through by brute force. If there was a way to survive this test without engaging the traps at all, he was going to find it. He stepped forward. Silence fell over the group as they turned to watch him. Some expected him to hesitate, others anticipated an immediate and grisly failure. After all, he was human, weak by galactic standards, incapable of regenerating limbs, healing instantly, or withstanding plasma burns. What hope did he have? Ryan ignored them. He knelt down, pressing his palm against the metallic floor, feeling the subtle vibrations beneath the surface. His fingers traced along the seams between the plates, noting the tiny gaps where they shifted under pressure. Then he looked up at the symbols lining the walls. He had seen similar markings before, remnants of a forgotten race whose technological brilliance had faded into obscurity. Most species viewed them as indecipherable relics, but he saw something else. a pattern. While the others had been analyzing the traps, he had been analyzing the system itself. Ryan stood, stepping back to where the AI professor floated, its red optic still processing the ongoing failures. He met its gaze, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You built this test using an ancient blueprint," he said. "But you never stopped to think about how the original creators designed it, did you?" The AI hesitated. "This labyrinth isn't just a death trap," Ryan continued, his voice calm, measured. "It's a security system, and every security system has an override." The professor's optic flickered, its processors whirring at high speed. "Your assumption is unverified. Then let me verify it." Ryan turned his attention back to the nearest wall, stepping closer to one of the glowing symbols. He studied the sequence, subtle variations in brightness, faint pulses like a rhythmic code, and then he pressed his hand against the right spot. For a second, nothing happened. The air was thick with anticipation. Then, with a low mechanical groan, the energy beams vanished. The floor stabilized. The high-speed projectile ports sealed shut. The labyrinth shut down. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. The competitors, the professor, even the silent walls of the ancient trial, everything seemed to be processing what had just happened. Ryan turned back to face the stunned group. His smirk deepened. "You were all trying to beat the system," he said. "I just turned it off." Ryan stood at the threshold of the deactivated section of the labyrinth, feeling the weight of the stunned silence behind him. The other students were still frozen in place, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The AI professor's optic flickered erratically, its processors struggling to reconcile an outcome that had never before been observed. The test was not supposed to be solved, it was meant to be survived. But Ryan wasn't concerned with their shock. He had no intention of wasting time explaining himself. The labyrinth was vast, and he had only neutralized one section. There were still countless traps ahead, and he knew that the deeper he ventured, the more adaptive the system would become. His advantage had been in recognizing the pattern before the others. That advantage would not last long. Without hesitation, he moved forward, stepping past the disabled section and into the next corridor. The walls here were different, sleek, reflective, and almost organic in texture. The pulsing glow of the alien symbols had shifted to a deep crimson, a clear indication that the labyrinth had recognized the breach in its system. It was no longer operating under its standard parameters. It was learning. Ryan kept his breathing steady, his footsteps light. He knew that brute force wasn't the answer. He needed to think, adapt, and most importantly, stay ahead of the labyrinth's countermeasures. He glanced back once, seeing that some of the alien students were slowly beginning to move. The reptilian warrior, still nursing his injured forearm, was watching him with narrowed eyes. The insectoid competitor, though clearly weakened, was scanning the walls with renewed intensity, likely searching for the same patterns Ryan had discovered. "They're going to catch on soon," Ryan thought. "I need to stay ahead." The moment he took his next step, the floor beneath him shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he felt the change immediately. The labyrinth was no longer waiting for someone to trigger its traps. It was anticipating movement. Ryan stopped, listening. The air was silent, too silent. Then, without warning, the walls themselves rippled. A sharp metallic screech echoed through the corridor as the sleek surfaces of the walls split open, revealing thin, bladed appendages that extended outward like the legs of a massive mechanical insect. They unfolded rapidly, their movements erratic and precise, each one tipped with a serrated edge that gleamed under the dim crimson glow of the chamber. The labyrinth had abandoned its traditional traps. It was adapting to his method of bypassing them. Ryan barely had time to react as the appendages lunged toward him. He ducked, twisting his body to the side as one of the blades sliced through the air where his head had been. Another shot toward his legs, forcing him to leap backward, barely avoiding a deep gash across his thigh. He could hear the other students scrambling behind him, some letting out sharp hisses of alarm as they witnessed the sudden escalation. The labyrinth wasn't just reacting, it was hunting. Ryan's mind raced as he analyzed the new threat. The appendages weren't random. They were controlled, directed by the labyrinth's core systems. The entire structure was behaving like a living organism, responding to his presence like a body reacting to an infection. He was the anomaly, and it was trying to eliminate him. He needed to move. Taking a calculated risk, Ryan sprinted forward, weaving between the thrashing appendages as they struck at him from all angles. The corridor was narrowing, forcing him to move faster, his heart pounding as the walls themselves seemed to close in around him. Then he saw it. A small, nearly invisible panel embedded in the ceiling. It was pulsing, flickering in a different rhythm than the rest of the symbols on the walls. It wasn't just another trap. It was a control node. That's it, he realized. That's how it's adjusting. With no time to hesitate, Ryan launched himself forward, dodging a sweeping blade by mere inches before grabbing onto a protruding section of the wall and using it to propel himself upward. He extended his arm, fingers brushing against the panel. The moment he made contact, the entire corridor shuddered. A piercing electronic screech rang through the chamber as the appendages convulsed, their movements becoming erratic and uncontrolled. Sparks erupted from the walls as the control systems momentarily destabilized, causing several of the blades to retract violently back into their compartments. The floor beneath him trembled, but he held firm, his muscles tense as he pressed his hand firmly against the panel, feeling the intricate patterns of energy pulsing beneath his fingertips. And then, silence. The appendages withdrew completely. The walls smoothed over, the crimson glow fading into a neutral, pulsing white. The labyrinth had reset. Ryan exhaled sharply, dropping back down onto the floor, his pulse still hammering in his ears. He turned just in time to see the other students watching him, their expressions a mixture of shock and something else. Something far more unsettling. Recognition. They had seen him do it once and they had dismissed it as a fluke, but now he had done it again. He wasn't just lucky, he knew how the labyrinth worked, and that made him dangerous. The AI professor, which had been observing in complete silence until now, finally spoke. Subject Shelton has demonstrated an advanced understanding of labyrinth mechanics. Probability of continued success. Recalculating, Ryan narrowed his eyes. The professor wasn't just recording his performance. It was adapting, along with the labyrinth. This test wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control, and he had just become the biggest threat in the room. Ryan straightened, his muscles still tense from the encounter. The air was thick with the scent of overheated circuitry, and the walls, once bristling with mechanical limbs, were now eerily smooth again, their pulsing white glow signaling the labyrinth's momentary dormancy. He could feel the weight of the others' stares pressing into his back, but he didn't turn. He didn't need to see their faces to know what they were thinking. He had solved another section, not by brute force, not by superior physicality, but by understanding the very nature of the labyrinth itself. That was something none of them had expected, and now they were paying attention. The AI professor hovered silently above, its single red optic flickering in rapid sequences, running countless calculations in real time. Its processors were attempting to predict his next move, but Ryan knew there was nothing predictable about what he was going to do. The labyrinth had adapted. Now, so would he. He took a step forward, moving deeper into the next corridor. The air was cooler here, thinner, as though the atmosphere itself had been altered. He inhaled through his nose, slow and measured, registering the metallic tang that hinted at a change in the labyrinth's internal systems. The walls were no longer just smooth metal. They were layered with something else, an organic texture, shifting faintly under the dim glow. The labyrinth was evolving. A faint vibration thrummed beneath his boots, so subtle it would have been imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, but Ryan was. He paused, kneeling down to press his fingertips against the floor. The vibration wasn't random. It was rhythmic, controlled, a heartbeat. The realization struck him like a cold wave. The labyrinth wasn't just adapting to him. It was anticipating him. He rose quickly, scanning the corridor ahead. The space was narrowing, funneling him forward like a trap waiting to spring. He could hear movement, soft, almost imperceptible shifts in the air, as if something was gliding just beyond the edges of his vision. His instincts screamed at him to move, but he resisted the impulse to react on reflex alone. That was what the labyrinth wanted. A shadow flickered along the wall to his right, then another. Whatever was waiting ahead, it wasn't mechanical. He exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The labyrinth had used brute force traps before, designed to overwhelm with sheer lethality. That had failed. Now it was changing tactics. He took another step forward. A sudden hiss echoed through the chamber. The walls pulsed. And then the shadows moved. From the ceiling, from the floors, from the very walls themselves, creatures emerged. Fluid and sinuous, their forms blending seamlessly with the shifting textures of the labyrinth. They had no eyes, no discernible mouths, just smooth, reflective exteriors that rippled like liquid metal. Their limbs were elongated, tapering into sharp curved edges that gleamed under the dim light. Ryan barely had time to register their presence before they attacked. The first one lunged, its movements impossibly fast. He twisted, narrowly avoiding the blade-like limb that sliced through the space where his chest had been. Another followed, striking low, forcing him into a desperate backward roll to evade the attack. They were coordinated, precise, not mindless drones, but something worse, predators. The labyrinth had created something new. It had stopped using static traps. It had started making hunters. Ryan sprang to his feet just as another creature lunged. This time he was ready. He shifted his weight, letting the attack pass just inches from his shoulder, then struck out, slamming his forearm against the creature's limb. The impact was like hitting solid steel. The thing barely reacted. Ryan's mind worked furiously as he danced between the relentless attacks. These things weren't just fast, they were learning. Each time he dodged, they adjusted, recalibrating their strikes with terrifying efficiency. He was running out of space. He needed an opening. His eyes darted across the corridor, searching for anything he could use. Then he saw it. Just above, near the far end of the chamber, the faintest shimmer in the wall. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he recognized it immediately. A control node. The creatures weren't independent. They were tethered to the labyrinth's systems. If he could disrupt that connection, he could shut them down. The problem? The node was 20 feet away, and the creatures weren't about to let him reach it. Ryan shifted his stance, recalculating. He didn't have the strength to fight them head-on, but he didn't need to. He just needed to get past them. He took a deliberate step forward, baiting them. The nearest creature reacted instantly, lunging toward him with a blur of motion. At the last second, he dropped low, sweeping his leg out in a controlled arc. The movement wasn't meant to trip the creature. It was meant to disrupt its balance, just enough to throw it off by half a second. That half second was all he needed. Ryan pushed off the ground, using the momentum to propel himself forward. The creatures reacted, their limbs slicing through the air in a desperate attempt to intercept him, but he was already ahead of them. He hit the ground in a controlled slide, rolling back onto his feet just inches from the control node. No time to hesitate. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the flickering energy panel. The moment he made contact, a surge of static crackled through the air. The effect was immediate. The creatures convulsed, their sleek forms flickering like disrupted holograms. Their limbs spasmed, movements growing erratic as the connection between them and the labyrinth was severed. One by one, they collapsed, their bodies dissolving into pools of liquid metal that seeped back into the walls. Ryan exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with the remnants of adrenaline. The chamber was still again, the only sound the faint hum of the labyrinth resetting itself. But he wasn't fooled. This wasn't over. The labyrinth had underestimated him once. It had tried overwhelming him with sheer force, and he had shut it down. Then it had tried adapting, creating something new, and he had outmaneuvered that too. Now it was going to escalate. Ryan straightened, his gaze locking onto the next passage ahead. The walls were already shifting again, their glow darkening into something deeper, something more calculated. The labyrinth was learning, and it was getting serious. Ryan stepped into the next chamber, his muscles tense, his breath controlled. The walls around him were no longer just shifting metal. They were alive with motion, pulsating with an eerie rhythm, like a massive, sentient organism waiting for its prey to make the first move. The air was heavier now, thick with the metallic tang of ionized energy, and the dim glow that had illuminated the previous corridors had deepened into a dark crimson, as if the labyrinth itself had become angry. He knew what was happening. The labyrinth wasn't just adjusting to his methods anymore, it was studying him. Every decision he made, every trap he disabled, every move he executed had been analyzed, processed, and integrated into a new strategy. The AI professor wasn't running this trial alone anymore. The labyrinth had taken over. Ryan took a cautious step forward, scanning the environment with sharp, calculating eyes. The floor was smooth, deceptively undisturbed, But he had learned that the most dangerous traps were the ones that gave no warning. His boots barely made a sound against the surface, but he could feel something beneath it, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, as though the ground was adjusting to his weight. He stopped. A low hum vibrated through the chamber, resonating through the metal walls like a slow, deliberate pulse. Then the temperature dropped. Instantly, the warmth of his breath turned to mist as the air around him plummeted into sub-zero temperatures in an instant. The transition was so sudden, so unnatural that his body struggled to react. His skin stung with the shock of the cold, and the moisture in the air crystallized, forming a thin, glittering frost along the walls. Then came the wind. It hit him like a physical force, an unnatural gale that howled through the chamber with terrifying speed. Ryan braced himself, lowering his stance, but the wind wasn't just strong, it was precise. It wasn't pushing him in one direction, it was shifting, twisting, creating pockets of violent turbulence designed to throw him off balance. He gritted his teeth, forcing his way forward, inch by inch. The cold was relentless, seeping through his clothing, numbing his muscles. His movements slowed, his body struggling to maintain its agility. He had to find the source. Had to understand the pattern before the labyrinth took full control. His gaze darted upward, the ceiling. It was shifting, rearranging itself in a way that was almost hypnotic, like interlocking puzzle pieces constantly forming and reforming, and within those shifting patterns he saw them, small, nearly invisible vents that were controlling the flow of air. It wasn't just wind, it was a calculated atmospheric weapon. Ryan's mind raced. The labyrinth had stopped relying on mechanical traps, stopped relying on physical obstacles. It had started attacking him at a fundamental level. His biology, his body, his endurance, his ability to withstand extreme environmental changes. It wasn't fighting him, it was breaking him. He had to act fast. His fingers were already stiffening from the cold, but he forced them to move, adjusting his stance as he studied the shifting air currents. If the vents were controlling the wind, then there had to be a system behind it, a sequence, a pattern. There, a small fluctuation, barely noticeable. Every 6 seconds there was a brief pause, a split-second delay before the air currents realigned. That was his opening. Ryan took a deep breath, forcing himself to ignore the pain in his limbs, the slow, creeping numbness that threatened to rob him of his mobility. He positioned himself, waiting for the precise moment when the vents would reset. Then, he moved. He surged forward, using the momentary lapse in the wind to propel himself toward the far side of the chamber. The cold clawed at him, the air howled around him, but he pushed through, his mind focused only on the exit ahead. He could see it now, a narrow passage at the far end, its entrance partially obscured by frost-covered mechanisms. The wind surged again, but this time he was ready. He adjusted his movement, shifting his weight at the last second, using the force of the wind itself to propel him sideways rather than resist it. It carried him just enough to reach the edge of the chamber, his fingers brushing against the frozen wall as he steadied himself. Then he saw it. A control node embedded in the ice-covered panel just beside the exit. His pulse quickened. It wasn't just another switch. This one was different. It was heavily reinforced, protected by an additional layer of shielding, as though the labyrinth knew he would find it. This wasn't just about stopping him. It was about outlasting him. His muscles ached, his body was screaming for warmth, but he forced himself to focus. He had no tools, no weapons, just his mind and his own body, and that had always been enough. He reached up, pressing his palm against the frozen surface of the panel. Nothing. The interface remained dormant, the energy within it locked away beneath layers of protective barriers. His breath was ragged, his vision beginning to blur from the cold, but he refused to stop. Think. He wasn't strong enough to break the barrier physically, and he didn't have time to try to bypass it through conventional means. Then he remembered something. The labyrinth wasn't just a machine. It was alive. It felt, and that meant it could be tricked. His body was failing, his core temperature dropping, his movements sluggish. The labyrinth wanted him to collapse here, to wear him down until he could no longer function. It was designed to measure endurance, to test limits. But what if those limits were manipulated? Ryan did something completely counterintuitive. He stopped fighting. He let his body sag against the wall, allowed his breathing to slow, his eyelids to flutter as if the cold had finally won. He let himself shiver, his muscles tremble, his limbs go slack. And then He waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the control panel flickered. Just for a fraction of a second, a pulse of energy surged through it, as though the labyrinth itself was assessing whether or not he was still viable as a subject. That was its mistake. Ryan's fingers, stiff and barely responsive, moved. He pressed into the panel at the exact moment the pulse surged. The reaction was instantaneous. The wind died, the temperature snapped back to normal, the frost on the walls cracked, melting away in an instant as the chamber's environment forcibly reset. Ryan exhaled sharply, pushing himself upright. His entire body ached, his nerves still raw from the cold, but he had won. Again. The AI professor's voice crackled through the chamber, its tone unreadable. Subject Shelton has successfully adapted to environmental manipulation. Probability of success increasing. Ryan wiped a hand over his face, shaking off the last remnants of frost. He didn't look back. The next challenge was waiting, and he was ready. Ryan stepped into the final chamber of the labyrinth, his breath steady despite the exhaustion pressing into his bones. His body ached from the cold, his muscles protested every movement, but he pushed forward. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the entire room came alive. The walls pulsed with energy, shifting in a synchronized rhythm, as if the labyrinth itself was preparing for its final move. The crimson glow that had followed him through the previous chambers had deepened into something almost tangible, like thick waves of heat distorting the air. This wasn't just another test. This was the endgame. The AI professor's voice crackled to life, its tone colder than before. Final phase initiated. Subject Shelton remains operational, analyzing probability of termination. Recalculating, Ryan's jaw tightened. He didn't need to hear the odds. He already knew what was coming. The room was vast, larger than any of the previous chambers, its ceiling stretching far beyond what the eye could track. The floor, however, was different. It wasn't smooth metal or shifting panels, it was a reflective, liquid-like surface, perfectly still, mirroring everything above it. A trap. Ryan crouched slightly, keeping his weight balanced, testing the floor with calculated movements. It held, but only barely. He could feel a faint instability beneath him, a sense that the surface was waiting for something. A reaction. A mistake. The walls began to shift again, but this time, they didn't form mechanical limbs or release energy pulses. They folded inward, collapsing into intricate geometric patterns, each panel rotating and clicking into place like the inner workings of a massive lock. And then the silence shattered. A deep, guttural roar vibrated through the chamber. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't an alarm. It was something alive. The liquid floor beneath Ryan shuddered, then split apart. From its depths, something massive began to rise. The first thing he saw was its eyes, two burning golden orbs emerging from the black liquid, followed by a towering, shifting mass of pure energy wrapped in an armor of ever-changing metallic plates. It had no defined shape, no distinct limbs, only a constant fluid transformation, adapting with every passing second. Its presence sent a wave of pressure through the chamber, a force so immense that even the walls seemed to pull away from it. Ryan didn't flinch. This was it, the labyrinth's final defense. It wasn't a machine, it wasn't a trap, it was sentient. The AI professor's voice returned, quieter this time. The architect has awakened, probability of survival unknown. Ryan's pulse steadied. He had come too far to stop now. The creature, the architect, moved first. Its form pulsed, and in an instant the liquid floor surged toward him like a tidal wave, twisting into razor-sharp tendrils designed to impale and tear. Ryan leapt backward, barely avoiding the attack as the tendrils struck the ground where he had been standing, melting back into the reflective surface. It wasn't attacking at random, it was studying him. Ryan had spent the entire labyrinth proving that he could adapt, that he could outthink the system. Now he was facing something that did the same, but with no limitations. He had to end this before it could learn too much. His eyes locked onto the walls, scanning the intricate patterns shifting across their surfaces. The labyrinth had functioned on rules, no matter how advanced. Even this creature, this architect, had to be part of a system. And systems had weaknesses. The architect roared again, its amorphous form reshaping into something monstrous, jagged appendages forming and breaking apart as it lunged. Ryan dodged left, rolling to avoid the strike, but the impact alone sent shockwaves through the floor, nearly throwing him off balance. He had seconds to act. Then he saw it. Amidst the ever-shifting patterns on the walls, there was a single point of stillness. A circular indentation, barely noticeable, untouched by the surrounding motion. It wasn't just an aesthetic detail. It was a failsafe. Everything had won. Ryan sprinted. The architect reacted instantly. It surged forward, its form collapsing and reforming, limbs stretching, spiked tendrils reaching out to intercept him. But Ryan was already moving at full speed, pushing his body beyond exhaustion, beyond pain. The ground beneath him cracked. The walls pulsed violently. The entire chamber was destabilizing. He lunged. His fingers brushed the failsafe. The moment he made contact, the chamber screamed. The architect convulsed, its massive form flickering as its structure unraveled. The crimson glow in the walls turned white, the shifting plates locking into place. The floor solidified beneath Ryan's feet, the reflective liquid dissipating into nothingness. The roar of the architect faded, and then silence. Ryan remained still, his breath coming in slow, controlled exhales, his hands clenched into fists, his body still coiled for a fight that had already ended. Then the AI professor spoke. Subject Shelton has completed the gauntlet. The words echoed through the now still chamber, reverberating off the frozen walls. Ryan straightened, exhaling fully for the first time since the trial had begun. His entire body ached, every muscle strained to its limit. But he had done it. He had won. The massive doors at the far end of the chamber groaned as they began to open, revealing the blinding white light of the outside world. The AI professor hovered beside him, its red optic dimming slightly, as if processing something beyond its usual calculations. No participant has ever completed the gauntlet with minimal physical damage. No participant has ever neutralized core systems instead of enduring them. No participant has ever forced the architect into emergency shutdown. A pause. You are unprecedented. Ryan smirked, rolling his shoulders as he stepped toward the exit. Yeah, he muttered, I get that a lot. The light engulfed him as he crossed the threshold, leaving the labyrinth behind. The test was over, but the real game was just beginning.